The Mexican prosecutor's office confirmed the finding of at least 113 bodies inside an unmarked grave in the municipality of El Salto.
Authorities thought they were chasing drug dealers. Instead, they uncovered something far darker. Across Mexico, mass graves have turned quiet farmlands and bustling towns into burial grounds of unspeakable horror. Bodies with no names, rituals no one dares speak of, and police badges buried beside the victims. But nothing compares to the pit unearthed near San Fernando, where what they found made seasoned investigators physically ill. When you see that part, you won't forget it. The first discoveries. It started with a single bone. In the dry outskirts of Tamaulipas in the early 2000s, a rancher stumbled across what he thought was animal remains. But the jagged edges and teeth told a different story. It was a human jaw. Local police, uncomfortable and under-equipped, brushed it aside as probably a migrant. But the man who found it never forgot. And soon, other stories began bubbling to the surface. Farmers finding shoes in freshly tilled soil, dogs bringing home bones, shallow pits giving off a sickly sweet odor. They called it coincidence. But the coincidences kept multiplying. In those early days, it was easier for authorities to label these deaths as one-off incidents between rival gangs. No one wanted to admit that entire burial sites were being formed, right under their noses. Even seasoned investigators described the atmosphere as eerily quiet, as if the towns themselves were afraid to speak. Whispers circled that victims weren't just murdered. They vanished without a trace, as if the ground swallowed them whole. Then came the first major unearthing. In Chihuahua, a group of mothers searching for their missing sons stumbled on a mound of disturbed earth near a dried riverbed. They dug with bare hands, no tools, no permits, just desperation. Within hours, they uncovered skulls, hair, and charred bones. That single act tore open the illusion. These weren't isolated deaths. These were organized burials. Some claim the women were warned not to dig further. Others say a government vehicle parked nearby, engine idling, lights off, watching in silence. But the discoveries couldn't be stopped. Search brigades began forming across northern Mexico, not led by police, but by families. Fathers, daughters, siblings carrying shovels and maps marked with anonymous tips. One disturbing rumor claimed that a former cartel driver anonymously sent GPS coordinates to a local church, wrapped in a blood-stained note. That tip led to a mass grave site just 15 minutes from a popular highway. What made it worse? Many early graves had been dug in land owned by seemingly innocent people, ranchers, small business owners, who later turned out to be cartel collaborators. A horrifying fun fact. In some regions, drug lords forced villagers to dig the graves of their own neighbors, then killed them afterward to keep it silent. Whether myth or not, it terrified entire communities into silence. People knew where the graves were, but speaking meant becoming part of one. The scale of the graves. By the late 2010s, the truth had exploded. This wasn't dozens of graves, it was hundreds. Mexico, it turned out, was quietly becoming one of the largest mass burial zones outside of a war zone. Some sites were shallow, hurried pits. Others were dug with industrial equipment, wide enough to hide entire pickup trucks. There were entire hillsides that, locals say, weren't always hills. Some even whispered that one grave was so large, it caved in a portion of a nearby trail, exposing bone and clothing in the mud after a storm. In some remote valleys, locals claimed they saw bodies being transported in meat trucks, wrapped like livestock, stacked, dumped. Others say they saw nothing at all. And that was more terrifying. Graves weren't just in the desert. They were found near schools, underneath bridges, behind factories, and, most hauntingly, inside abandoned churches. In one bizarre case, a former cartel home had a grave under its pool. The water had been drained, but the floor beneath was hollowed out and covered in cement. Once cracked open, it revealed 18 decomposing bodies, some clutching rosaries. There are stories of mass graves being discovered when dogs dragged human limbs into towns. In one village, residents thought they were haunted, hearing moans at night from the hillside. When police dug, they found a grave of 44 people, many buried alive, mouths filled with cloth. Satellite imagery later revealed odd thermal patterns in desert terrain, hot spots that didn't match weather or vegetation. When search teams arrived, they found scorched bones and makeshift fire pits, as if someone had tried to burn evidence on a large scale. Entire burial grounds were discovered this way, not by confession, but by heat. The most chilling part? Locals started giving nicknames to these places. One was called El Infierno, hell. Another, La Boca, the mouth. A dig site in Veracruz was simply called El Silencio because no birds sang there, even in spring. Signs of torture and execution. When forensic teams first began pulling bodies from the earth, they hoped for answers. But what they found were horrors that even seasoned crime scene experts struggled to describe. It wasn't just the number of corpses. It was the condition they were in. Limbs twisted unnaturally, hands tied behind backs with shoelaces, phone chargers, or even wire. Blindfolds fashioned from torn pieces of shirts, faces gagged with duct tape or stuffed with rags. Some had multiple bullet wounds to the head. Others had none, just fractured skulls, broken ribs, or signs of strangulation. What made these scenes more haunting was the detail. Some victims were stripped of their clothes entirely, found in fetal positions, suggesting they were made to kneel or crawl before execution. Several bodies bore signs of acid burns, chemical damage, and blunt trauma, consistent with iron pipes, bricks, or even carjacks. In one grave near Guerrero, an entire cluster of skeletons had been scorched. Forensic investigators believe they were set on fire while still alive. Neighbors swore they had once seen strange columns of black smoke, followed by silence that lasted days. Even more disturbing were the small traces left behind. Cigarette butts with lipstick stains, discarded food wrappers, empty bottles of liquor, and in one case, a half-melted clown mask. It became clear these killings were not just executions. They were prolonged, theatrical, cruel. One cartel-defected member once testified that torture was recorded, filmed as warnings or trophies. There's one particularly horrifying case whispered among grave searchers of a pit where 5 victims were found wearing soccer jerseys, all numbered 13, and all had their tongues removed. Theories abound. Some say they were part of a team that refused to cooperate with cartel demands. Others think the numbers were symbolic, perhaps a date, or worse, a message. What keeps many forensic experts up at night isn't just the brutality, but the patterns. Certain wounds appear repeatedly. Shattered kneecaps, severed ears, marks of electrocution on the soles of feet. It suggests methods, routines. These weren't crimes of passion. They were procedures. Someone practiced them. Someone perfected them. And still, even in their worst nightmares, experts weren't prepared for what they'd find next. The Narco rituals. In a secluded area near the Veracruz jungle, searchers uncovered something that stopped them cold. At the center of a mass grave site was a crude stone altar, ringed with black candles, chicken bones, and burnt photos. One image was of a police officer, his eyes gouged out with ink. Another was of a woman holding a baby, both faces crossed out. Beneath the altar were two skulls, deliberately arranged to face each other. This was one of the first widely known discoveries linking mass graves to narco rituals, a blend of folk religion, criminal cruelty, and occult obsession. Authorities began to find evidence of Santa Muerte, Saint Death, worship at several grave sites. Statues, shrines, prayers carved into stone or wood, and in some cases, bowls filled with blood. Former cartel members claim that before major killings or hits, sacrifices were made, sometimes animals, sometimes humans, to cleanse the operation or gain spiritual protection. One infamous belief is that sacrificing a traitor while chanting over a Santa Muerte altar ensures loyalty from others. A chilling fun fact? In one grave, searchers found not only bones but also a printed prayer soaked in candle wax and stuck to a skull. The prayer was for obedience in the ranks. Witchcraft elements also appear in the form of brujeria, Mexican folk sorcery. Black feathers, dolls with needles, melted coins, and even dried scorpions have all been pulled from graves. One site in Sinaloa reportedly contained a jar with a severed tongue inside, surrounded by scrawled chants in Nahuatl, an ancient Aztec language. Experts are still unsure whether it was traditional ritual or cartel theater. But locals swear that screams can be heard at night from the surrounding area. Not all rituals were meant for enemies. Some appear to have been aimed at empowering the killers themselves. In one disturbing tale passed among morgue workers, it's said that a cartel assassin once bathed in the blood of his victims before burying them, believing it would make him invincible. While no evidence was officially recorded, a grave in Michoacan did reveal two bodies entirely drained of blood, with their hearts removed cleanly. No knife marks, no trauma, just missing. Who the victims really were. For a long time, the narrative was controlled. Officials, press releases, and even televised announcements often echoed the same line. These were cartel-on-cartel killings. The buried, they claimed, were all criminals. But when the families started digging, the truth rose from the dirt. These weren't just soldiers in drug wars. Many were civilians, migrants, students, women, even children. Each life swallowed by silence. In one of the most gut-wrenching revelations, a mass grave near San Fernando, Tamaulipas contained the remains of 72 Central American migrants, their wrists still bound, many with bullet wounds to the back of the head. Investigations revealed they had been captured while trying to cross north and were given a choice: join the cartel or die. They chose death. One man, an Ecuadorian named Luis Freddy Lala Pomavila, survived with a bullet wound to the neck and crawled through miles of brush to raise the alarm. His testimony shook Mexico to its core. More and more, the faces of the victims didn't match the labels. University students wearing backpacks, women in nurse uniforms, teenagers in sports jerseys. In Iguala, Guerrero, the infamous case of the 43 disappeared students sparked global outrage. Witnesses claimed police handed them over to cartel members. The students were never seen again, and although bags of human remains were later found, many believe the full truth is still buried, literally. Some victims had IDs in their pockets. Others had wedding rings, school notebooks, or tiny trinkets, teddy bears, bracelets, prayer cards. These weren't signs of war. They were signs of everyday people who vanished while going to work, or while traveling to see family, or while refusing to pay an extortion fee. One haunting detail. In some graves, entire families were buried together. Parents, even children. One such site in Veracruz held 8 bodies in one grave. A couple, their 3 kids, and their cousins. The youngest was just 2 years old. Locals claimed the family had refused to vacate their land when cartels wanted it for growing crops. They stood their ground, and they were erased. Evidence of government collusion. Perhaps the most devastating twist in Mexico's grave crisis wasn't just who was killed, but who allowed it to happen. In site after site, forensic teams started noticing disturbing clues. Police badges buried next to victims, spent casings from military-grade weapons, uniforms mixed with civilian clothes. At first, officials said it was planted evidence, but there were too many coincidences. In a mass grave outside Coahuila, investigators found a decomposed body with a rusted police radio still attached to the belt. Not far from it, official-issued boots and a jacket stitched with the emblem of the state police. What was even more chilling? The victim wasn't a cop. He was a school teacher who had gone missing months earlier after attending a protest over rising cartel extortion. Witness testimonies, especially from cartel defectors, painted an even uglier picture. In some towns, local police didn't just turn a blind eye, they actively helped. They intercepted migrants and handed them off. They detained innocent people under false charges, only to disappear them. One former officer confessed that certain shifts were labeled as pickup duty, where the goal wasn't law enforcement, but extraction. In one case that drew national scandal, a local mayor in Veracruz was caught on a tapped phone call arranging the removal of a journalist. Days later, that journalist's body was found buried, along with a dozen others, in a sugarcane field. The implication wasn't subtle. The graves weren't just filled with enemies of the cartels, they were also filled with enemies of corrupt officials. This web of silence and complicity has made justice almost impossible. Families don't just fear the cartels, they fear the very institutions meant to protect them. Prosecutors ignore tips, cases get lost in paperwork, evidence goes missing, and in some rare situations where arrests are made, suspects mysteriously escape. The most damning accusation came from a mother who had spent 7 years searching for her son. When she finally found his body, in a shallow grave just outside the town where he vanished, she told reporters, "The killers wore uniforms, and they smiled when they took him." The forensic nightmare. If finding the graves was horrifying, identifying the bodies was an entirely different level of torment. Forensic experts across Mexico faced an impossible task. Thousands of commingled remains, exposed to time, heat, chemicals, and fire. Some graves contained nothing but fragments, jawbones, vertebrae, partial skulls. Others held entire skeletons, burned beyond recognition, or stripped of all soft tissue. In some cases, only teeth survived. In others, nothing could be separated, just a mass of bones, tangled and melted together in a single pit. Cartels poured acid on victims, dumped them in oil drums, or burned them in piles with tires to intensify the flames. One forensic technician admitted that in some graves, bones disintegrated the moment they were touched. In Coahuila, officials discovered what they called bone soup, a thick sludge of water, ashes, and human remains left stewing in an underground tank. And worst of all, many graves had been disturbed before discovery, either by animals or by criminals returning to move the evidence. As a result, fingerprints were rare, dental records nearly useless, and DNA often the only hope. But even that hope ran thin. Mexico's national DNA database is limited, and with over 100,000 officially reported missing persons, the backlog is immense. Each test takes weeks, sometimes months, and many families can't even afford to submit a sample. Some must wait years for a call that may never come. Others receive only partial results. We found a bone that matches your daughter's femur, but we don't have the rest of her. It's not just the science that's broken, it's the infrastructure. Morgues are overwhelmed, freezers are overstuffed, and many grave sites go unprocessed because there's simply no one left to dig. Forensic labs have described needing to triage bones, deciding which victims get analyzed now and which will have to wait indefinitely. The horrifying legacy. It would be comforting to believe these atrocities are buried in the past, that the graves are old, but they're not. New ones are still being discovered. Between 2020 and 2024 alone, officials uncovered dozens of new grave sites across Jalisco, Veracruz, Sonora, and Guanajuato. Some were found by accident: a collapsed well, a broken construction dig, a farmer who noticed his livestock refusing to graze near a certain patch of earth. Others were discovered by the relentless work of family-led search brigades, civilians armed with shovels, pickaxes, and unimaginable courage. And these graveyards are spreading. Entire regions are now feared as silent cemeteries. In Jalisco, locals whisper that certain farmlands are cursed, not because of folklore, but because no one dares plant there anymore. Some graves were even found beneath roads or new housing developments, victims laid to rest beneath the very feet of the living. In several cases, construction workers uncovered skulls while digging foundation trenches. And in one particularly chilling instance, a school was built just 500 feet from a site that turned out to contain over 40 bodies. Parents were never informed until the story hit local news. The tragedy isn't just about the dead, it's about what their burial means for the living. Every pit tells a story of someone who screamed, someone who begged, someone who vanished, and was buried without name, without ceremony, without justice. If this left you questioning everything, make sure to subscribe, because the next discovery might be even darker. And tell us, which part disturbed you the most, or have we only scratched the surface? Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.